Okay, today's daf is probably the most important in Masechta. Is it discusses what is Malchus. So the funny thing about Gemaras is that the main idea is always left for the last. Like in Masechta Gittin, they describe how to write a get only in the last parak. Here we're describing how they made Malchus. Now, one thing is certain, and that has to be clear. It's supposed to hurt. It's not. It's supposed to hurt and you're supposed to feel, hurt by it, but not humiliated. In other words, that you're going to see that if there is another humiliation because of it, for example, somebody, he relieved himself while they're giving him the malchus, they stop the whole thing because he's been humiliated enough that they stop the whole malchus. So it's amazing. Here, the Mishnah is to describe the process of how the malchus was done. What's the instrument that they hit him with, and then what happens during the malchus. So let's see. Says the Mishnah, Kate said malka noisai. This is on Chaf Chaf Beis Amid Beis. Kate said malka noisai. How did they give malchus? Koifin shtei yadav al ha'amud helech ve'echlech. They bend his hands. They wrap his hands around let's call it a stump, a tree stump, uh, uh, around and around. The chazan hakneses oiches bivgadav, and the person who's in charge of the malchus holds his clothing, and he grabs it very hard. Im nikru nikru. If he rips the clothing, he rips the clothing. Vim niframu. If he rips it by the seams, niframu. It's ripped by the seams. In other words, the idea is to just try to rip it off because the whip has to touch his body. It can't, you can't touch his shirt. So they rip off his shirt.
What about if it's a woman?
Oh, it doesn't say. I guess you're
They
right.
get Malchus too, right?
Yeah, yeah. Uh, I guess the shirt is left on.
Right.
Yeah, I guess the shirt
I
is.
would imagine.
Yeah, but you do have to give malchus on the front of the body. So I don't know how that's done. Achu megala is liboy. Let's see. Until they reveal his stomach, navel, and heart. Now, the guy's the guy's leaning over a tree stump. Imagine the evan suna ma'acharev, and there's a stone right behind the guy who's hunched over this tree stump. Who's going to stand? That's like a step stool. Chazan hakneses oimid. The guy that's giving the malchus stands on that stone. Uritsu biyodei, and he has a whip in his hand. Shel egel kafula echad l'shnayim l'shnayim la'arba. He has a double whip that's made of calf hide. Oh, shtei ritzuis shel chamor oilus v'yordus boy. I'm going to show you a picture. It's two ritzuis. So if take a look at the picture over here, this is from Steinsaltz, and his understanding is you see the double loop over here. That is a whip made of the hide of a calf, and then the two things sticking out. They actually had to have a little piece of uh, hide from a donkey. So the whip is made to look like this, made from both the hide of a calf of an ox and the hide of a donkey, and there's a reason for that. Now, okay, now Yada tefach. The handle was a tefach, v'rachba tefach, and the width was a tefach. And so if you look at the picture, the handle on the bottom over here was a length of a tefach and a width of a tefach. So you could grip it. And if when you whip him, the leather should be long enough that it could go around and touch his navel. So it should go around his back and touch his navel. Says the Mishnah, Umaka oisa, you whip him shlish milfanav, 1/3, like 13 in front of his body, ushte yados malachroiv, and 2/3 on his back. The Eina Maka oisa loy oimed, he's not standing when you're whipping him. V'lo yoshev, he's not sitting. Elamuta means he's hunched over. Shenama, the pasuk says, v'hi piloi hashoifet. The shoifet has to bend him over. But when the guy that's giving him the whip has to use only one hand, if he uses two hands, it's not going to be as hard. We want to get more power into it, so use one hand on the whip. But while they're reading while he's getting whipped, v'hakoire koire im lo yisishma lasus v'ivla Hashem es makois chamakos ushmatem es divrei abis v'hu rachum yichaper ove. He reads a couple of psukim as it's written in the Mishnah, and as he's being whipped, you read him those psukim, about 39 words. If they didn't finish and he still needs to get whipped more, they reread it again. In other words, these psukim remind the guy why he's being whipped. Let's say while he's being whipped, he died, potter. Then the guy that's in charge that did the whipping, he's exempt. Why? Because every person goes through a health exam before he gets this whipping. So if the health exam determined that he's capable, healthy enough to get the whip, so if he died, that's not the fault of the person giving the whip. Let's say he gave him an extra whipping, an extra one. Let's say he mistook in the count. They told him only whip this guy 20 and he gave him 21. Then the guy who's giving the whips will have to go to Golis because he killed somebody by mistake. Now, here is what I was discussing. Let's say while they were whipping him, he relieved himself. Niskalkel, if he humiliated himself, bein beret, whether he did excrement, bein b'mayim, whether he urinated, potter, that's it. They stopped the whole thing. So because he's humiliated. Rabbi Yehuda says not so fast. Ha'ish berei. Here you go. A man, if he does excrement, then they stop the whole thing. But if he just urinates, then they won't stop it. La'isha b'mayim. But a woman, when they're whipping her, so then as soon as she urinates, they stop the whole thing. Now we go to top of Chav Gimel. My tam mishum nikla. So the question on the Gemara is, why do we like bend them over and do all these things? Because Nikla, we want him to feel, bad and feel ashamed of what he did. Amma Rav Sheshes Mishum Rab Loza ben Azariah. Rav Sheshes said in the name of Rab Loza ben Azariah, Benayin l'ritzua, how do I know that the whip, shehi shel egel, that's made out of calf hide, Iksiv aboam yakenu. The Torah tells us you whip somebody 40 times. Usmich lei, and next pasuk says lishach shemshar b'dishay. Seems like an irrelevant pasuk, but the pasuk says you shouldn't muzzle an ox when it's threshing. You have to allow the ox to eat. So since it says shar next to the word malchus, so we notion that the whip has to be made from the hide of an ox. Okay. That's called smuchin, not like a hekesh. Hekesh is one pasuk. Smuchin is two psukim. Another thing. Once you say that, Rav Shesha said another statement in the name of Rab Loza ben Azariah. How do I know that a woman who fell as a yibam, and her yibam, potential yibam, is a sick person, an ugly person, and she says, I don't want to get miyabim to him. So we don't silence her. The pasuk says, don't put a muzzle on the ox. When the parsha of Yavama. So we see from there that once the Yavama has a say in it, in other words, you can't force a yibam on her against her will. If she doesn't like the way the guy looks, her potential yibam, she can say, I don't want to marry him. The Amar of Sheish Mishum Rab Loza ben Azariah. If you shame and degrade the chalamoid, this is what it means chalamoid. It's as if you're serving idols, because in chalamoid you're not supposed to work unless it's ultimately very, very necessary. But if you just shame the chalamoid, it's like you're serving idols. Don't make any idols. And Smichlei, and the next pasuk says, "As Chag Amatzos Tishmar, the holiday of Pesach, you should keep." So that the connection between these two psukim is that if you're not going to treat the chalamoid nicely, the Torah compares it with respect. The Torah compares it as if you did avodah zarah. Now it says Rab Sheshes is another thing. Rab Sheshes Mishum Rab Loza ben Azariah. Kol hamasape lashon hara. Whoever speaks negative. This is this week's parsha. And somebody who accepts negative reports about somebody. Someone who testifies falsely. That person should be thrown to wild dogs and be eaten. The pasuk says, you throw it to the dogs. The next pasuk says, don't accept a false testimony. And don't relate a false testimony. Don't accept it. In other words, don't accept lashon hara about somebody. And if you do, or you speak it, it's worthy of you to be thrown to dogs. Tana, we learned the Shtei Ritzuos. Tana, why was the whip made of donkey? Part of the whip, as we said before, is made from donkey hide. So Tana, we learned that the Brisa Shel Chamara was from donkeys. Kidudar Shahi Geloi Alei Rav Chizda. Yoda Shar Kaneu v'Chamois Evos Balav. The shar knows it's who bought him, and the donkey knows who is the owner of its trough, where it gets its food from. And God was complaining, but the Yisrael, the Jewish people, lo yada, they don't know about me, that I'm their creator. So God, rebukes the Jewish people with a donkey and an ox. So therefore, Amar Kadosh Baruch Hu, Yove Mishimaka Eves Balav, the one that the donkey and the ox, who know who their owner is, should take retribution against a Jewish person who does not know who his boss is. And that's why the whip is made out of a donkey and ox hide. Amar Abaya, Abaya was troubled if every whip has to meet somebody's neighbor. Let's say you have a big guy, so you have to have different size whips. So Abaya felt that every bezdin has different size whips depending on the person that they're whipping, the size of the person that they're whipping. Amalei Rava, so Rava said, in came Nafesh Lurutsuas Tuva, then there's going to be a lot of whips and bezdin, and that's very expensive. They had like a certain mechanism on a regular whip. They could lengthen it or they could shorten it by tightening it. So you generally they had one whip. Malkin oise, minohani mili. How do you know? You give him 1/3 in front and 2/3 on his back. Amarav kahana da'amakra v'pilu hashoifet v'ko. They bend him over and they whip him lefonov in front of his body. Kidei rishasei b'misba, according to one count of his evilness. So if you have 39. Risha achas 1/3 milfonov is whipped in front of him. Shtei rishiyos me'achara, but 2/3 of the whip should be on his back. Ein malkin oisay. Amar Rav Chizda, Amar Rav Yochanan, Menayin l'ritzu shumach peles. How do I know that they double over the whip? Like I said over here, if you see in the picture, they double it over. They turn it over, so make it a double whip. How do you know you do that? Shnema v'hi piloi. And the piloi, it's as if it's written the hich piloi, like kaifel. They put in a chaf there. I don't know. Says the Gemara legufay. That teaches you. Well, what do you mean? The piloi teaches you that you have to hunch over. In Cain, if it was only teaching you have to hunch over, lichtev kra yateu, bend over. They should bend him over. My piloi, make him fall. Shmami notati, it's teaching you two ideas. One, that he has to be hunched over. Two, that the whip has to be kefil, doubled over. Hamaka maka biyodek. Tana Rabban, the rabbis taught. Who is the guy that's in charge of the whipping? So now the Gemara discusses that. Ein mamidin chazonin el chasuri koyach v'yisei rimada. You don't put a guy to do the whipping unless he's a weak person and he has high intelligence. So that's a very interesting thing because you don't want him to do it too hard. So you pick a guy that's chasere koyach, doesn't have too much energy, but he's very intelligent. Rabbi Yehuda, I meant the opposite. Afila chasere mada, you even can take somebody has no intelligence, the yisei koyach, and he's very strong. Amar Rava said, Kavasi Rabbi Yehuda mistabra. It makes more sense, right, what Rabbi Yehuda says. The pasuk says, "Lo Yosef pen Yosef." The Torah tells us that the bezin has to warn the guy that's giving the whip not to overdo it. If you're telling me that the whipper was a person that was lacking intelligence, that's why you have to warn him. If he was a person of high intelligence, do you have to warn him? I mean, of course he knows not to overwhip. Answers the Rabbanan. Rabbanan says, no, really you take somebody of high intelligence and less power, because ein mizarzen el mizuris. You don't warn somebody, only somebody who can accept a warning. If somebody with low intelligence won't take your warning seriously. Tana, we learned in a brisa. When you lift it to get a backward swing, magbiya b'shtei yadav. You take both of your hands and somehow you could stretch further with two hands. But when you actually do the whack, maka b'yadei achas, you whack with one hand. I guess it should be powerful. I guess you can't whack with two hands. You have to whack with one hand, so it's powerful. Tana Rabbana, the rabbis taught a godol shabadayanan kairi. The godol of there's three bezdin that's there when they're whipping the guy. So the elder of the bezdin, he reads the psukim. Hasheni moinet. The second one counts the numbers. The hashlishi, and the third guy, the third part of the court says oime hakeu, whip him. So bisman shemaka maruba, when there's a lot of whips, let's say he's supposed to get all 39 maruch. So then they lengthen out the time to say the psukim. Bisman shemakamu at this. Let's say they assessed the person that he's only supposed to get a minimum makos. Let's say they're supposed to get only 9. Makatzer, they do the psukim very quickly. Says the Gemara, what's the big deal? We learned in our Mishnah that if they finish early, they repeat the psukim again. So why do they have to time it so that the malchus is finished when the reader of the psukim just finishes reading the psukim? Answers the Gemara, mitzvah letzamtzem. It's a mitzvah to get it right. In other words, to finish the last pasuk when you're finishing the last whip and the last word with the last whip. But if you couldn't do it, then you have to reread the psukim. Tana Rabbanim, makaraba elu ela makaraba. It says you should give him a whack, a big whack. Makamu etes manayim. How do you know that you give him a small whack? A small whack. Talmud Bavli Daf Yomi. Torah tells you don't even give him one more extra. So you can't even give him a little bit, even a 1 or 2 extra. And came ma Talmud Bavli makaraba. Why does the Torah say that you have to give him a very great whack, a great whip? Limed al rishoinish hein makaraba teaches you, and like we've been saying all along, that it has to hurt. You can't just tap him. It has to be a makaraba, a very great whip. This kalkel, if he soiled himself. Tanu rabbanim, echad ish v'echad isha b'rei v'loy b'mayim. Divrei Rav Meir. Rav Meir holds by soiling yourself, it's only with excrement, whether you're male or female. That's when you get exempt from continuing on. That's what Rav Meir says, but not if you just urinate. Rabbi Yehuda ish b'rei ish b'mayim. Rabbi Yehuda says that a man is with excrement, but the woman is with urination. The Chachamim said, echad ish v'echad isha bein b'rei bein b'mayim. It doesn't matter, male, female, whether you do excrement or you urinate. That's very fascinating. So in the middle of the whacking, if the guy, lets himself go and relieves himself, that's it. He's exempt, whether he's a man or he's a woman. Now, the Mishnah said that Rabbi Yehuda, the Brisa said, Rabbi Yehuda said, ish b'rei ish b'bayim. But Tanya, we learned in a Brisa, Rabbi Yehuda echad ish v'echad ish b'rei. Rabbi Yehuda says, whether a man, whether a woman, it's with excrement. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak shneim shavim b'rei. They both are equal with excrement. Even Rabbi Yehuda would agree that a woman would go free with rei, but he adds that a woman would also go free with urination, but not a man. Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Shmuel said, what happens? Kafsu, they tied him down, Viratz, and he broke away from what they tied around, and he ran away. Mi bezdin. That's fascinating. So he was humiliated because he was on the whipping block, so to speak. Potter is exempt. Meisvei, we'll ask you a question. Kala, if he soiled himself, bein birishayna, before they started whacking him. Bein b'shniya, after they started whipping him, patronoisai, they exempt him. Nifsaka ritzua, if the whip broke bashniya after they started whipping him, patronoisai. Again, they started whipping him, and all of a sudden the strap broke. So then they exempt him. But if it's before they started whipping him, ain't patronoisai. If the whip broke, then they won't exempt him. Amai, why shouldn't they exempt him? Even before they start whipping him and the whip broke. Lehevi Kirotz, it should be like a guy who ran away. Since they had to tie him down to the post, he was embarrassed. So that should be enough to exempt him. And says the Gemara, Hassam over there, Rutz. He had to untie himself and then run away. So running is part of the embarrassment. So therefore, that by somebody who ran away because he untied his knots, he gets exempt. Hach over here, Loy Rutz, he didn't run away. He's tied to the post and the whip broke. So that's not enough of an exemption. Tana Rabbanim, if they made an assessment that if he's going to get the whip, he's going to soil himself. If they can assume that after he's going to get one or two whips, he's going to soil himself, they right away, let's say he has a weak bladder, so then they're gonna exempt him. Let's say let's say they assess him that only after he's going to leave the bezdin, after getting whipped, he's going to relieve himself. Malkan, I say, still give him the malchus, because he wasn't relieving himself while having the malchus. Even if he relieved himself before getting whipped, malkan, I say, we still give him the malchus. Shnema v'ko v'nikla. Only through the whipping, that should be the humiliation. But if while you're whipping him, he has another reason that he's being humiliated, so then like relieving himself, then he's exempt. But not somebody who will get the malchus and then relieve himself, then we won't exempt him. New Mishnah. Kol chayave krisis shalaku. Anybody who's chayav krisis that get malchus. Let's pick a lav of krisis of somebody who's mazana with his sister. So chaysishtoi. So you get karis. If you get malchus, you niftedru yedei krisasa. You're exempt from karis. You're exempt from dying young. Shnema v'nelikla chichalei necha. Because as soon as you get the malchus, you're like his brother, and therefore God forgives you, provided you do tshuva. The Amar Rab Chanina ben Gamliel says, sometimes you do an avera and you chayav krisis, so you can lose your life. But if you do this mitzvah of, first of all, allowing yourself to be whipped, and secondly, you're doing tshuva after you're getting whipped, so certainly you could save your life. They're going to give you your life back. Mida Toiva is 500. They pay you 500 more than what they do when they punish you. So certainly, if someone does a mitzvah, you're certainly going to get your life back. Rab Shimon, you learn it from the pasuk about krisis. This same idea. Torah says you get krisis. Then we go to Amid Beis. If you do these mitzvahs, you get life. The Torah gives you extra longer years. The idea is, if you sit and don't do an avera when you could have done an avera, they give you reward like as if you did a mitzvah. Rab Shimon Barabi says, the pasuk says, Rak chazak levilti achol sadam ki adam hu hanefesh. Don't eat blood, because blood is the life soul, and you get karis if you eat blood. The avera of eating blood, a person's appalled and disgusted by eating blood. If you hold yourself back from eating blood, you're going to get good reward. Gezel v'arayis, stealing or adultery, that the human person is somebody that desires that. Umachmatam, he's covets that. A Pirish man, if you hold yourself back and separate yourself from them, from Gezel and Arayis, achas kama, certainly not only are you doing good for yourself, your generations and generations that come after you are going to benefit from you holding yourself back from Gezel and from doing anything related to arayos. It's a big thing that the Mishnah says. And then the Mishnah concludes, Rav Chananya ben Akasha Oima, Ratza HaKadosh Baruch Hu, L'zakes es Yisrael, L'ficha chir b'lehem Torah u'mitzvahs, Shnema Hashem Chavetz, Mansigdil Yaldu Torah V'yada. HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted to give a lot of merits to the Jewish people, to train the Jewish people to better the soul. So he didn't give us just one mitzvah and one little piece of Torah. It's tremendous amount of learning that you can do and mitzvahs that you can do and perfect. And that way you can merit a tremendous amount. That's why HaKadosh Baruch Hu increased the size of the Torah and the mitzvahs. Amar Rabbi Yochanan. We'll stop in another 2 minutes and we'll stop. Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan says, Chalukin olav chaver al Rabbi Chananya ben Gamliel. Rabbi Yochanan said that not everybody agrees to Rabbi Chananya ben Gamliel. Rabbi Chananya ben Gamliel said that if you get malchus, you're exempt from kares. Rabbi Yochanan said the Chachamim would disagree with that. You're still always going to get the kares. Amar Rav Ada bar Ahava, Amri Bei Rav Tanina. That is our Mishnah. As a Mishnah that says, Ein bein Shabbos Yom Kippurim. There's no difference between when you violate Shabbos or Yom Kippur. They both have the same lamates malachos. El shezeh doina b'nei adam. When you violate Shabbos, you get skila. V'zeh zadoinai. When you violate Yom Kippur on purpose, you get kares. Then Isa, if the Mishnah held that by getting malchus, you're exempt from kares, idi v'idi b'nei adam. Who you could say that both Yom Kippur and both Shabbos, you can are zadoine b'nei adam. Shabbos you get skila, and Yom Kippur you can get malchus. So this Mishnah, our Mishnah over here in Masechta Megillah, it does not hold that if you get malchus, you're still exempt from kares. Kares is always there. Rav Nachman says, Hamani Rav Yitzchak. That Mishnah goes according to Rav Yitzchak. The Amma Malchus b'chayave krisis leika. There is no malchus by chayve krisis. So Rabbi Yitzchak was the Tanya we learned in the Brisa. Rabbi Yitzchak chayve krisis b'chlal hori v'learn yatzis kares b'chaysei l'dana b'kares v'lei b'malchus. Rabbi Yitzchak is of the opinion that no such a thing that you give a chayve krisis malchus. So that therefore maybe that Mishnah that says by Yom Kippur you only get kares, because that Mishnah is Rabbi Yitzchak who holds that there's no such a thing, that there's another punishment for Yom Kippur, either kares or either malchus. Rav Ashi says, "Afil l'teimer Rabbanan." You could even say it goes according to Rabbanan, and really you could give malchus on somebody who violates Yom Kippur. And if he violates Yom Kippur and gets malchus, he's exempt from kares. But what does the Mishnah mean? The main thing is that you get the punishment. But punishment with b'dei adam by Shabbos, the main punishment is skila, and the main punishment by Yom Kippur is b'dei shemayim with kares. But it's true, if you get malchus, you can be exempt from kares. Finally, the Gemara says, and we'll end with this: Amar Rav Ada bar Ahava, Amar Rav. Halacha ke Rav Chananya ben Gamliel. The halacha is like Rav Chananya ben Gamliel, that if someone who's supposed to get kares gets malchus, he's now exempt and forgiven in heaven from getting kares. Rav Yosef had this statement: Man salak le'ela ba'asa ba'ema. I wish somebody would go into heaven and tell us that what you're saying is true. How do you know it's true that somebody who gets malchus, God in heaven is going to forgive him and not kill him? We don't know. Who's going to go up to heaven and tell us that it's true? But anyway, the Gemara holds that it is true, that if someone gets malchus, although he's supposed to get kares, and does tshuva, he can undo the kares, and in Shemayim they're going to let him live long. Okay, we're going to stop over here.